Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 21 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Chris, Feeney, and Seb with me. Chris, how's it going?
It's going well, Andy. I'm about a week away from vacation, so the end is coming, at least for this week. I'm excited.
Me too. Me too. You brought it up, so I'll say this. I mentioned had this conversation with someone on a podcast the other day about being on vacation, and then I started thinking about in our security world, maybe we don't tell people on the podcast we're going on vacation.
That's right.
I know
I'm not really.
But I got to assume there's security nut jobs out there, and I say nut jobs, but it's people who take security seriously. They hear us say stuff like that. Oh, you're idiots. You shouldn't say that.
Yeah. Well,
maybe we record this like 3 weeks different from when we release it, so you wouldn't know. Maybe it'd show up and we'd actually be home.
That's right. Let's pause on this for another 2 weeks before we put it out there.
Yeah. Seb, we were just chit-chatting before this about the weather, and Chris and I are here in the Southeast. And the Southeast is beautiful and green and lush almost all the time, except for the peak of the winter and if we have a really bad drought in the summer. And that is because we have this little thing called humidity in the Southeast, which is the reason why we have such green, lush vegetation. And it's the reason why, things look so beautiful here. I have a question for you guys, and I do this to people all the time this time of year. The southern United States and the southwestern United States have grown rapidly over the last decade or two. Can either of you tell me what the number one reason for that is? And I'll give you a hint. It's a technology.
Honestly, no clue, to be honest.
A technology. Number one reason. Oh gosh, let me think here.
It's super simple.
I mean, internet.
No. Air conditioning.
Truly.
Without air conditioning, most people in the southern U.S. states, whether southeast, southwest, wouldn't live here. You wouldn't survive. People for decades, hundreds of years would move south to, we had our gold rush here in North Carolina. We had agricultural people would move here and then go back because you couldn't cool, but you could heat. So people would move back to places where at least at nighttime it cooled off. In fact, I think, the age of a country like Germany and the population base there, I think you guys have the benefit of having kind of moderate temperatures, right? So people can bear with it in the southern part of the United States without air conditioning. And we have that occasionally when the power goes out or something. It gets brutal quick.
Yeah, we had a pleasure.
Sorry, go for it.
No, I was just to say we took a summer vacation to France a couple of years ago, and Paris was really nice. We went up to Normandy for a little bit. That was really nice. A little bit chillier in the mornings, but very pleasant. And then we went up to see our friends in the Netherlands, and just a drive just through the countryside and everything like that. I wasn't sure what to expect. And of course, we were right before we went, there was I think a big heat wave, or right after that, people were swimming in the pools right there in front of the Eiffel Tower. I mean, Seb, you probably remember that. It was back when the World Cup was going on with the Women's World Cup.
Oh, yeah.
So, but our friends out west, they're getting crushed right now with the heat. So not too much to complain about here.
Yeah, our air conditioning's working. We're good.
That's right.
So the same discussion we already had a couple of times with Douglas Brown too, because we are not such used to use the air conditioning in our offices or wherever you go. And the first thing that Doug is mentioning as soon as he is coming back to Florida is air conditioning back again. So that's really interesting.
It's massive, and we just take it for granted these days where we live.
I know.
And then it's not so for granted. Well, I do want to talk about the topic that we have. I do want to come back. We're going to do a more fun topic, a funner topic this week around the UI and customizing the UI. And Seb and Chris are going to help walk us through that. I do want to come back to the security thing that we agreed not to talk about this week because we've talked about it over the last couple weeks because it's so important these days. Chris, going back to this similar type of conversation, I thought about it after our last call. what is the number one technology that's enabled this malware, ransomware thing to happen?
For the audience, Andy has not prepped me for any of this. So the number one technology that has, well, repeat the question again.
What's the number one technology that's enabled this security ransomware situation to happen? And I believe it's the biggest concern we have in the world today in terms of stability, future stability.
Oh, man, I have several things that come to mind. I'm going to go with email.
Email? Seb, you want to take a swing at it?
I would say everything related to web browser.
Related to what?
Web browsers.
Web browsers. So as you guys know, in life, almost everything in your life comes down to money. The only things that aren't supposed to come down to money are your family and potentially your religion. But even those are very much controlled by money. If it wasn't for the rise of cryptocurrency and the ability for the attackers to get paid for doing this bad stuff, it wouldn't be happening.
Kind of true.
Imagine if you had to write a check to the guy and you had to send it to their house. They wouldn't be able to get away with it. If you had to transfer money into a bank account that couldn't be closed instantly, you could track down who opened the bank account. And believe me, we got attacked a couple of years ago using that old school method.
Oh.
You know, yeah, I was thinking about the, everybody probably got that Nigerian cousin thing some time ago, but yeah, no, I think you're right. I was just thinking about the first time I heard about ransomware. I'm like, ransom, how are they going to pay you?
Yeah.
And it was back when I guess the only option was Bitcoin. Now there's Bitcoin plus potentially others, Dogecoin, you know, so
yeah. And here's what I mean by the future state of this. You take a country the size of the United States of America and all these different states that have their own beliefs and their own ability to make their own laws that are constantly trumped by the national government's laws. What if they decided they didn't want to do that anymore? They can't really leave the United States of America because they don't have a currency. And it's even more and more tied to the central bank now than it was back in the 1850s, 1860s when we did have a civil war in the United States. Imagine now the ability to have a currency that's worldwide that had value, even if you decided to leave the country you were part of at that moment in time. I think the ability for organizations to separate themselves from their parent organization that have always been tied to financial constraints, I think that the cryptocurrency world economy value is going to change that. And I think the next 100 years are going to be interesting when the state of Texas, which kind of thinks it's a country anyway, can decide that it's going to go do its own thing, and the United States of America can do whatever it wants. They're all good because they'll have their own currency to go trade and barter with countries like Germany.
Wasn't it Ecuador who proposed to use Bitcoin as a central cryptocurrency or something like that? Wasn't it?
It was I think it was a Central American country, but it was just recently they announced that they would begin accepting payment, normalized. Right. It reminds me of not quite some of the same, but a few years back. This is before in America the prominence of the chip card was out here. Where, if you were to travel to Europe and you didn't have one of those chip cards, all you had was a swipe. Very likely you'd run into a merchant that, you couldn't pay. You needed some form of payment. And I think, I don't know exactly what it was, but I think one of the accelerators, certainly two things, the banking laws were changed so that the merchants were put in a position of being, if something were to happen, right, a card gets compromised and they didn't have the chip card thing, that security, then that would be liable versus the banks, for example. And so that, but it was an expensive move. But then you had something like Target, that was a big one where identities were stolen, that type of thing, and that kind of forced Target to move in that direction rather rapidly. But we could talk on that topic But Andy, you sideswiped this. We were heading down this customized, have fun with IGEL story.
My point in doing that is we had a really good conversation last week about security, and I wanted to tie security back to financial rewards or financial payments. Mm-hmm. And I made the conversation about the air conditioning. And after our call the other day, I started thinking about, okay, what's really enabling this thing to happen? Is it vulnerabilities in applications and software? Yes, but it's the real driver is the fact that somebody can now get paid and get paid anonymously. That's really changing the game. And I think it's going to have a lot of impact on what you see going forward. Mm-hmm. But on this topic, what we decided to do today in a more of a lighthearted way is to talk about customizing the UI. There was a new Tech Tip Tuesday video that came out that we like to review videos on our podcast. So basically, it's a video blog, how to customize the IGEL OS interface GUI. And I bet it's going to have a lot to do with using the UMS to do so. So Seb, you kind of want to talk us through what this video that you guys put out, what it was covering? And
yeah, sure.
Let me say this real quick. The IGEL interface that's by default is nice enough, and a lot of people use it. At the same time, you may be trying to make it look like Windows because you're trying to make sure users don't feel like they're using something other than what they're used to using. And then the other part of that too is customizing so it looks like your company. 20 almost years ago, I worked for a company that had probably one of the smartest desktop administrators I've ever met. Got him Adam May here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Adam, one of the things he said to me early on was we need to put a wallpaper on all of our end user desktops because that shows ownership of the desktop. If you allow users to put their own custom picture of their kids on their desktop, then all of a sudden it's their personal computer and they think it's theirs, not the company's. But Seb, you want to kind of give us a walkthrough of what this video covers?
Yeah, sure. So I would say let's start with what IGEL OS is delivering. So we stay on the operating system level on a Ubuntu 18.04 64-bit operating system. That's the base, but the base is not covering the graphical user interface itself, where we are using the XFCE as a window manager. So this XFCE is a pretty light and effective window manager and is able to deliver a lot of customizations. But I want to be clear and hopefully bring down some expectations maybe sometimes. We cannot at the moment deliver the same user experience like you might have on Windows 10 or even on Mac OS, because there are missing dependencies and we would have to rewrite a couple of things. Not saying we'll not do that in the future, because the operating system look and feel is getting more and more important at the moment, and we don't want to be stuck in this thing client operating system level anymore, but more becoming, and we are at the moment, an operating system vendor. So just to set a proper expectation, we will cover a few things, all supported by IGEL OS and by the UMS. But if you want to look into the deeper side of the iceberg, the XFCE is giving a lot of tweaking method, but that might be part of an upcoming tutorial. So let's stay on the last sentence that you mentioned, or the sentence before regarding the corporate identity. We have, and that's, I guess, somewhere about minute 2 or 3, the already covered by the Getting Started guide from Douglas Brown, or the firmware customization piece of the UMS. So the firmware customization, if you look at the UMS console itself, is this kind of magenta colored F symbol, which is not meant to cover custom partitions, which is not meant to deliver some command line information to the endpoint. It's really just changing the graphical user interface.
Hey, Andy, for those that were watching this video, I can actually pull up mine because I've got while we're talking, I've got a UMS up and a custom IGEL that I've made some changes to recently. So let's see here. Let me see if I can do that. I think you just need to give me rights to share.
Yeah. So, and we'll do that. Chris, keep in mind, for a lot of people, it's going to be audio, but we are planning to put these videos out on our YouTube channel in the coming months.
Very good.
I will make you a co-host to do so.
Awesome. Yeah, because you can have some real fun with this. Let's see here.
But Chris, don't focus on showing it because most people are not going to see it. So
not a problem.
Stay with Seb's commentary.
So what he's talking about, keep going, Seb. I'll move this over to the right. And,
okay, perfect. So the firmware customization feature instead of the UMS is, let's say, the newer way of delivering corporate identity elements to your operating system. Why I'm saying newer? Because we were already able to deliver wallpapers, boot splash logos, etc. on the old world by using a profile. So just keep in mind that if you are already a customer of IGEL for, let's say, 10 years, 6 years, or 5 years maybe, you might have some profiles where you defined, or the user interface, custom wallpapers, some download servers, etc. Just be aware that this firmware customization is covering that in a way more powerful way because it's easier to understand and easier to customize. So just in case that the newer, like I said, something like 4 years ago, maybe 5, where we introduced this feature into the UMS. So basically what we are doing there is creating for you a couple of things around a file that you want to get available on the endpoint. Could be a wallpaper, like already mentioned. Could be a boot, so let's say on the wallpaper maybe. So you can define inside of the firmware customization element if you want to use it on 1 screen, on 2 screens, on 4 screens, and you can even there upload the file during that process. And if you would like to have, let's say on screen 1, one specific wallpaper, on screen 2, a second one, an absolutely different one. That's something that you can do that with 1 click. Just choose the file and replace it by another one. So that's the wallpaper part. On the boot splash, so if you boot up the device, you usually get a kind of BIOS or UEFI showing up. And just after that, you get this IGEL OS logo with your firmware version on the bottom right corner. This symbol can be replaced by your company ones. Or if you want to play around and maybe keep the old boot trace that you have installed over the last years, that definitely is a way to go. Just keep in mind that the quality for the boot splash is definitely less than for a wallpaper. It's just a question on how the boot splash logo is displayed. But yeah, like explained, it's just what kind of logo is showed up during the boot up process. Then we have all the custom logos. So let's think about if you click on the start menu where we have at the moment the IGEL logo, that's something that you can replace by your company logo. Same for if you click on the start menu itself and then the start menu is open, you have on the core of the top corner left a symbol, which is at the moment an IGEL OS one that you can replace by your own one, etc., etc. So you can go pretty deep into customizing that graphical user interface and make it compatible to your corporate identity or to your marketing rules. That's the easiest way to make an end user feeling more comfortable with the new IGEL solution, because it might look like exactly like the operating system before. So that's more or less what the firmware customization is doing. And the only thing I wanted to mention again is it's not some weird command line interface, because firmware customization seems like let's say a term that might introduce a few weird things into your mind. It isn't at all. It's really only meant to customize in a supported way your operating system.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Yeah.
No, I was like, I was just saying, yeah, there's some great use cases as you were going through them. The wallpapers. If I go to create one right now, you know, with that feature, you've got the start button, the start menu, the taskbar background, which I've not played around with that much. Screensavers, boot splash, and wallpaper. So, and some really cool stuff. The one thing that I think it was, gosh, first about 3 years ago, there was on the, it's probably still out there on the community site, the customization guide. It included the ability to, you know, custom icons for applications. And so playing around with that feature, I actually went out and found some internal to the IGEL OS itself this one right here. And for those that at some point will watch a video, but then there's just grabbing icons off the internet and just replacing. These are basically browser sessions, but I replace it with like a Citrix logo or go to Office 365, for example, or YouTube video. So that's a fun thing you can also do if you. That would be done more or less in the registry. You'd have to upload the icons through the file section. You upload, and then that'll put it in WFS, and then in the registry you would go in under a browser session or something, and you can just change the icon /WFS name of the icon, for example, PNG file. In most cases, will do the job, and you can have fun with that. So, but that's another cool little feature as well, and that will go down to the start menu. It'll be on the desktop if you want, or it'll be in the application menu here. That icon will appear in all those locations. So,
yeah, that's great. Especially the screensaver ones that I totally forget to mention. And thank you, Chris, for remembering me that. It's pretty handy to have your screensaver updated by your marketing department. I mean, it's not happening that often, but you can also deliver, let's say, some informations by using the screensaver. So we have some marketing departments who are delivering custom wallpapers and also custom screensavers to devices that are in some stores to make some advertisements, so some ads and some publicity for some products by just replacing, let's say, weekly the wallpapers and screensavers, just to give some special offers on, I don't know which kind of products they're offering. So yeah, that's right.
I know for my days covering healthcare, I would see that almost at all these locations. I would go visit hospitals would have some wallpaper that would be, if it was flu season, there would be something about foaming in, foaming out. That was a pretty standard one. They might have a blood drive announcement, and they would just have this custom screensaver that they would update and push out, and you'd see it as you're walking around in these places where the machines weren't being used necessarily. So pretty common. I'm sure other types of industries might use it, but healthcare is one of those where I definitely saw that used pretty widely.
So guys, I know you kind of teed this up by talking about this a little bit. What currently lots of customers get away with not using the latest way to do this, and they're using the older legacy ways to just give a basic, look and feel.
Mm-hmm.
This is really like, what do you expect the adoption of this way of doing it to be? And what are you seeing in the field? How long have you been able to do it this way? Start with that.
Like I said, I would say 5 years, 4 years, something like that. Okay. But for the 10 years before, I can speak for all our, at that time, IMP training that we delivered. It was somewhere under display, user interface display, and then you had your custom wallpaper server, which was basically in most time UMS. Then you had to enter the path to your file. So it led to a lot of tickets and of support requests, because you could make a lot of typo error there. And I guess the acceptance for the firmware customization is pretty high, because it's just a wizard, next, yeah. Assign it to an endpoint and you are good. And before, it could lead you to a lot of headache, to be honest.
Right. Well, and I guess that's my ignorance, right? Because I always just kind of hack together a little something to demo, but I know my team does a lot to make it look just like Windows. So that's how they're doing it, is this way. So
yeah.
Let me just blow through these bullets real quick, just so our listeners can understand what all is included here. So in the video, we have an introduction. We have how to do a custom wallpaper, custom boot splash. Seb, Chris, what is custom boot splash? I know what it is, I think, but go ahead and explain it real quick.
That the boot splash is the logo that is showed when the device is booting up. So that if you boot up the device, you have your UEFI BIOS showing up, and just after that, you have the IGEL OS logo and the firmware version on the bottom right corner. And this big, let's say, moving IGEL OS logo can be replaced by your company logo, like an example. And
it should be said here that if you do any of these things using it this way, you're not creating yourself any kind of support concern, because it could easily be, well, first of all, be supportive. And if you had to, you could just take this away and figure out if your problems went away with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cosmetic stuff. I mean, a lot of it is point and click kind of things. So earlier I had, just the older way of changing the taskbar, the wallpaper background or something, that type of thing. But it's very difficult to get yourself into a place where you've totally screwed it up without being able to revert back to, all right, let me just go back to defaults and start again.
Yeah. So custom start menu logo, that's obvious what that is. Change the IGEL OS theme to lights. You're talking about just the color scheme?
Yeah. Yeah, these are the built-in ones you're referring to, Seb, right? The light, like the default one is that charcoal gray, dark kind of thing, but you can change that.
Yeah.
Remove taskbar. And as I'm saying some of these things, especially we start talking about removing taskbar, I should explain something to our listeners. There's a concept in our industry of thin operating system Linux, and then there's a concept of zero operating system Linux, which is a very bad misnomer. Zero clients, zero Linux, whatever it is, has always been kind of misleading because there was always an operating system there. It's just all this other stuff was stripped out, and people were told it was zero. It's not. It's just extremely lightweight operating system. And some of these things that we're doing are ways to take the thicker but extremely powerful and manageable and deployable, updatable IGEL thicker operating system, which is still very thin, and make it look and feel like a zero operating system. So people ask all the time, hey, should I use the IGEL zero operating system? I'm like, no, get the lightweight, thicker one, and then you'll have all the power you need, and you can do something like this to make it look and feel thin.
That the appliance mode, especially the appliance mode, is bringing, let's say, one-click solution for all your needs if it comes to lock down your operating system and lock down your graphical user interface. If you think back, I would say also 3 to 4 years back into former times, the appliance mode was pretty restrictive. It's still, but it's a little bit less than before, because in the former times, you just had the appliance mode and you couldn't open anything else besides the Azure setup. At the moment we have, and that's just a thing that I want to mention for people who are using that kind of zero approach, you have still the ability to check a checkbox on most features that you have on the sessions, accessories, or even on custom partition, and saying, allow appliance mode access, which is somewhere on the bottom of your screen when it comes to auto start, how to name your shortcut. But that's absolutely true. And if we leave that appliance mode beside, we are mostly creating profiles to, let's say, rebuild the appliance mode in a light way, where you can then give some people the access to a specific feature, to others don't, and you can play a lot around with that, and even giving some the ability to check the actual time on the taskbar or not. And that's what we are doing then with all the profiles mentioned later on, like the taskbar on top of all windows, or make the auto hide of the taskbar. So even if the user is not seeing the taskbar, it's still there. But he has really to move his mouse to a specific point to get the taskbar coming and showing up. But for the rest of the time, it looks like the device boots up. You just have your self-service or AVD login, and then you go through into your VDI or terminal server session. So it doesn't really have to interact with the local operating system anymore.
Yeah, that's great. So I was thinking of a use case there outside of appliance mode. One of those would be like a kiosk where maybe all they're accessing is a browser full screen or something, right? That maybe they authenticate, or maybe they use it to just to show, maybe it's a tracking board or something, right? But there's nothing else that they would need to interact with. Maybe the ability to reboot the device, but not necessarily shut it down. But those are things that you could do. And obviously you can hide the taskbar, system tray types things. But there's a lot that I find when people first see this and they're coming from I want it to be that limited experience, they look at what the default settings are, and I'm reminded just to say, hey, what you're seeing here is completely customizable. We could strip this down as much as possible based on what you're looking for. So
guys, let's just let's flow through the rest of these just to make sure we let our listeners know what all is possible, simply possible. Make taskbar auto hide. Seb mentioned that. Make taskbar on top of screen. So at the top of the screen, Seb mentioned that as well. Taskbar on top of all windows. So we don't have to ever go minimizing stuff to find it. Removing the clock, which sounds fairly trivial, but if you're using, say, a remoting protocol like Citrix or something else, and you're trying to just prevent the idea that the user even sees a clock that might be different from the clock in the remoting session. Remove system tray from taskbar. Remove system from start menu. Remove start menu theme. Change text colors, icons. Change taskbar color. Change highlight, and change OS fonts. Between all of those things, it's pretty easily doable to try to make the interface, the GUI, look like something that your company, one, would be proud of, and two, that shows ownership of who owns that system.
The important thing on how we handle all that stuff in the video is everything that you're seeing there is supported and is out of the box available in your profile, so you don't have to tweak around. One thing which is also pretty important, because at the moment we just, and that's between marks, only have 2 themes. I just jump back to the IGEL Dark or IGEL Light theme. It helps a lot if you have customers who has an, I don't know how to say it in English at the moment, but some handicaps with looking at specific colors on the screen. So have some color differentiation difficulties. It's pretty good to have an ability to change it from a dark to a light mode, because it's then easier to read sometimes. So we don't have this properly spoken high contrast theme that you might need in specific disease, or but you can change a lot, and especially on this font and color and size, you can help your users who are experiencing that kind of experience a lot by just changing a few things for him or for her, and assigning it then maybe by using shared workspace to his own user, even if he or she is roaming between different devices. And that's definitely something that I want to mention, because in the past we had to deal with some scripts or command line tools to get that kind of stuff working. And at the moment, it's just out of the box. And just one last thing when we stay on themes, we had an IGEL community kind of competition, I think it was 3 years ago, where we had to create, let's say, the most interesting theming with firmware customization for IGEL OS. So a couple of people participated, and I went the route down to create a Mac OS theme for IGEL OS, where I integrated an external theme instead of our own ones in the IGEL operating system. Just to be clear, that's something that is not supported at the moment, but we might see something like that in the near future, that supported themes could be changed. I don't know if it's something that might come in an upcoming IGEL OS operating system, or if we will integrate that in a kind of custom partition, but that's definitely something amazing, especially for people who have a problem with their color differentiation.
Yes, Seb, are those configurations documented somewhere where people could go, and if they saw one they liked, they could emulate it?
Yeah, that's the firmware customization getting started guide mentioned by Chris and myself at the beginning. That's covering really pretty much everything in a documented way. So yes, definitely. Okay. So just go to igelcommunity.com and go to getting started, and you will find even the profiles that you can import to your UMS and tweak around for your needs.
Well, and I would stop here and give some guidance. It's great that us, the systems administrator, can do magical things with the UI. It's most important that your users like it and want to use it, and that we give them a say, right? We're going to tell them they're not allowed to print because that's what security's told us. Let's at least give them a say on what it looks like. You know, you go to buy a car, and maybe you're buying it with your significant other, and you know exactly what kind of car you're going to buy, but you let them pick the color. That little bit of empowerment could go a really long way.
Yeah, what's nice too is on the color. I know internally, IGEL has, you know, in our marketing department, a color official color guides based on, you know, RGB kind of codes, and so you can go in there and punch those codes in and get the exact approved marketing colors or color schemes. That's also an option. if your marketing department has a particular, officially approved, company color schemes, primary or secondary options, that's a nice option as well.
Okay. Well, guys, what have we not covered here that we wanted to cover on this topic?
Just one thing that Chris mentioned, the, let's say, half of the podcast. We spoke about the registry and how to change a specific icon. That's a topic that I didn't cover in the tutorial, because I was mostly focusing on everything which is available also box in the, let's say, upper part of the iceberg. But it's definitely something that is also covered in the Getting Started guide for the firmware customization itself. If you want to add your own logos into a Citrix session or browser session, like Chris mentioned, just go to the Getting Started guide, and it's really explained in a step-by-step guide how to get there, how to deploy the files, and how to use it. Because the term registry might give you a kind of complexity in the first step, but give you also a lot of flexibility when it comes to that kind of configurations.
Yeah, this is, as you see on the screen here, so this is the Chromium session I set up in the registry under sessions, Chromium, in this case 107, which I've got several Chromium sessions. There's an icon, and you just change the default is going to say Chromium. You just switch that to /WFS/ in this case, the path to the PNG file. And you can do that with Firefox and Chromium. I think you might be able to do it with the Citrix Workspace app, but I have not tried that yet. But I used UMS to upload them to WFS, and then just modified this, and it was pretty simple to do. And it takes place right away. It doesn't require reboot, so that's nice.
So Chris, assuming that you're right, and you can do that with the Citrix session, that gives me yet another soapbox moment, which is no one should call their Citrix environment Citrix or their VMware environment VMware. They should have a custom branded name, and using something like as simple as a logo here to give people the visual representation of their company app store or their company VDI, or insert name here. We have one customer, for example, that calls theirs Web Connect. But anything other than Citrix, and using anything that says Citrix, and I don't know which one specifically you're showing here, but this would be an example of what I don't want is the word Citrix anywhere on the screen.
Yeah,
because as you guys know, there's legacy ideas about whether it works or not. It works. It's just a matter of whether the environment works, and people kind of brand that Citrix into a 4-letter word, and they cannot get that out of their mind.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. These little cosmetic things, I was thinking about a trend that I began to see in healthcare is in Epic accounts, where they were branding the project. It wasn't Epic, it was something else, Care maybe, or whatever word they chose, and that was the word that was being promoted, even though behind the scenes it was that application, but they I don't know if it was encouraged or highly recommended by the vendor, but it was more than one time that I saw that. Well, this is, we called it whatever, right? And whatever marketing came up with.
Think about it. You could have it called X, Project X, which some of my customers do on the beta, on the pilot version. And then if that goes wrong, you just now call it Project Y, and everybody think, oh, this Project Y thing is so much better than that Project X thing. It's like, well, it's the same thing. We just redid it and did it right.
That's right. No, totally.
Yeah. The human being, right? That's it's an interesting, we're interesting creatures. This will be another one of my things is who's the real cockroaches of the world? It's the human being. We're the ones destroying everything. Think about it. But we have
a lot of trash out there in the ocean because of it. So
yeah, we're it. We are the cockroaches of the world. All right, well, I'll leave you on that. Have a good day.
Awesome. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for doing this. So much. As always, good to talk through this stuff, and we'll just keep them coming, and hopefully people are getting value out of this either today or 5 years from now when they go back and listen to the recording or watch the webinar version of it, the online version, the video version.
You mean it's a time where we will buy Microsoft? Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, when that happens. All right, gentlemen, thank you. Have a good rest of your Tuesday. Seb, you're what, halfway through yours?
Yeah. it's mostly done. We have a couple of webinars and technical partner onboarding today, but then it's done.
Oh, that's all fun stuff. That's good stuff.
That's right.
All right, guys. Thanks. We'll do it again next week.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care.